There is a kind of peace the world cannot give, and there is a kind of peace the world cannot take away. Many people are not physically tired, they are mentally exhausted. Their thoughts run faster than their strength, their worries speak louder than their faith, and their minds never learn how to rest. But divine rest is not the absence of problems, it is the presence of trust. God often begins his deepest work not in changing your situation, but in training your mind to stop reacting like fear is in control. Because the real battlefield is not in your environment, it is in your thoughts. When the mind is unsettled, even blessings feel like burdens. But when the mind is anchored in truth, even storms lose their authority. Rest is not laziness. Rest is spiritual maturity. It is the ability to say, I will not carry what God never assigned me to control. There are moments when life feels like it is moving too fast, doors are closing too slowly, and answers are not coming at all. In those moments, the human instinct is to panic, to fix, to force, or to figure it out. But God often interrupts that cycle with a quiet invitation. Be still. And being still is not doing nothing, it is refusing to let anxiety lead. The mind learns rest when it learns dependence. And dependence is built when you finally accept that you are not the author of outcomes, you are only responsible for obedience. God does not just want to solve your problems, he wants to reshape your thinking. Because a restless mind will misinterpret everything. Delays will look like rejection. Silence will feel like abandonment. Pressure will feel like punishment. But a renewed mind begins to see differently. It sees timing, protection, and purpose, even in waiting. There is also a spiritual discipline in letting go of mental arguments. Not every thought deserves a response. Not every worry deserves attention. Some thoughts must be surrendered the moment they appear. Peace grows where surrender begins. And as you grow in this journey, you realize something powerful. Rest is not found when life becomes easy. It is found when your trust becomes strong. A strong trust says, even if I don't understand, I will not lose my peace. Because God is not only working in your situation, he is working in your mind. Teaching it to slow down, teaching it to stop striving, teaching it to breathe again in faith. Rest begins in the very moment a person decides to release control, and that decision is often far more spiritual than emotional. Most people do not realize how deeply the need for control is tied to anxiety. When a person feels uncertain, their natural reaction is to tighten their grip on outcomes, people, timelines, and expectations. But the more tightly they hold on, the heavier life begins to feel. Control gives the illusion of safety, yet it quietly becomes the source of internal pressure. The mind was never designed to carry the weight of outcomes it cannot guarantee. That is why exhaustion increases not only from what is happening in life, but from the constant mental effort of trying to manage everything at once. Releasing control is not giving up, it is recognizing limits. It is the understanding that human effort has boundaries, and beyond those boundaries, trust must take over. When a person releases control, they are not stepping into weakness, they are stepping out of illusion. The illusion is that if they think harder, worry more, plan longer, or anticipate every possible outcome, they can somehow prevent disappointment. But life consistently proves otherwise. There are events that no amount of planning can stop, and there are outcomes that no amount of anxiety can change. This realization is not meant to create despair, but to open the door to surrender. Surrender is where rest begins because it shifts responsibility from self to something greater than self. Releasing control also requires confronting the fear that sits beneath it. Most people hold on tightly because they fear what will happen if they do not. They fear failure, rejection, loss, or uncertainty. So control becomes a coping mechanism. But coping mechanisms often become cages. The mind becomes trapped in cycles of overthinking, replaying scenarios, and imagining worst-case outcomes as if preparation can prevent pain. Yet this mental activity rarely produces peace, it produces exhaustion. The heart was never meant to live in a constant state of prediction and prevention. When control is surrendered, fear begins to lose its influence. Not because circumstances instantly change, but because the internal pressure to manage everything is lifted. There is a quiet strength that enters when a person says inwardly, I cannot carry this alone anymore. That moment is not defeat, it is alignment. Enter with truth. Truth is that not everything is assigned to human responsibility. People often take ownership of things that were never placed in their hands. Outcomes belong to time, process, and divine orchestration in ways the human mind cannot fully compute. Effort is required, yes, but obsession is not. Work is necessary, but worry is optional. When a person begins to separate responsibility from control, peace starts to grow. Responsibility means doing what is right in the present moment. Control means trying to secure every possible future outcome. One is healthy, the other is draining. Rest emerges when a person focuses only on what is required today and releases the burden of what has not yet arrived. There is also a transformation that takes place in identity when control is released. A controlling mind often believes that everything depends on its performance. It carries the silent pressure of believing that if it does not stay alert, everything will fall apart. This creates a deep sense of tension even during moments of success. But when control is surrendered, identity shifts from being the manager of outcomes to being a participant in a larger process. This shift brings humility, and humility brings rest. Because now life is no longer a constant test of personal ability to keep everything together. Instead, it becomes a journey of trust where effort is given, but outcomes are no longer worshipped. In practical life, releasing control often starts with small internal decisions. It is the moment a person chooses not to rehearse negative scenarios repeatedly. It is the decision not to mentally argue with situations that have not even happened. It is the quiet discipline of stopping the habit of trying to solve tomorrow's problems with today's mind. Each time this discipline is practiced, the mind learns a new pattern. It learns that survival does not depend on constant mental struggle. Over time, the nervous system begins to soften. Thoughts become less chaotic. Emotions become more stable. And slowly, rest begins to take root, not because life has become predictable, but because the mind has learned to stop fighting what it cannot control. A restless mind does not simply misunderstand life, it reshapes it into something heavier than it actually is. When thoughts are left untrained, they begin to interpret every delay as rejection, every silence. E as abandonment, and every obstacle as proof that nothing will ever improve. This distortion is subtle at first, but over time it becomes the lens through which a person sees everything. Reality itself does not always change, but perception becomes strained, and that strain creates unnecessary emotional suffering. A renewed mind, however, learns a different way of seeing. It begins to recognize that not every closed door is a punishment, and not every waiting season is a mistake. Some delays are protection, some silence is preparation, and some uncertainty is simply the space where growth is happening unseen. The human mind is naturally wired to seek immediate meaning. When something happens, it tries to label it quickly. Good or bad, success or failure, progress or loss. But life is far more complex than immediate interpretation. Many of the most meaningful outcomes in life only make sense in hindsight. At the moment of discomfort, the mind often cannot see the full picture, so it fills the gaps with fear. A restless mind assumes the worst because uncertainty feels uncomfortable, and discomfort is often misread as danger. But a renewed mind learns to tolerate uncertainty without turning it into a threat. It begins to say, I do not understand this yet, but that does not mean it is working against me. That single shift transforms emotional response. When the mind is restless, it becomes reactive. It jumps from thought to thought, constantly trying to solve what is not yet solvable. It replays conversations, analyzes delays, and imagines outcomes that have not even occurred. This mental overactivity creates emotional exhaustion because the body begins to respond as if imagined fears are real events. Stress hormones rise, peace decreases, and the present moment is lost. But a renewed mind interrupts this cycle. It learns to pause before assigning meaning. It learns to separate facts from fears. A fact is what is actually happening right now. A fear is what might happen in the future. Rest begins when a person stops treating fears as facts. There is also a deep spiritual dimension to perception. A restless mind often assumes absence where there is actually process. When answers are delayed, it interprets it as silence. But silence is not absence, it is often alignment happening behind the scenes. Growth does not always announce itself. Just as roots grow under the ground before a tree becomes visible, many life processes develop in hidden ways before they become evident. A renewed mind begins to trust what it cannot yet see. It stops demanding immediate explanations for every season and starts believing that meaning will unfold in time. Another transformation that occurs in a renewed mind is the ability to reinterpret struggle. Instead of viewing difficulty as evidence of failure, it begins to see it as evidence of development. Pressure is no longer automatically labeled as punishment. Sometimes pressure is preparation. Just as physical strength is built through resistance, emotional and spiritual strength often develops through seasons that challenge comfort. A restless mind resists this idea because it seeks ease above growth, but a renewed mind begins to value transformation more than temporary comfort. It understands that discomfort is not always destruction. Sometimes it is construction. As perception shifts, emotional stability begins to grow. The same situation that once created panic begins to produce reflection instead. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? The renewed mind begins to ask, what is this shaping in me? What question changes everything because it moves a person from victim thinking into growth thinking. It creates space for patience, and patience reduces emotional volatility. Over time, this renewed way of thinking becomes a habit. The mind stops rushing to conclusions. It becomes slower, more grounded, and more aware. It learns that peace is not found in controlling outcomes, but in trusting the process that unfolds beyond immediate understanding. And in that trust, perception becomes clearer, fear loses its dominance, and life is no longer interpreted through panic, but through a quiet confidence that even in uncertainty, something meaningful is still unfolding. Peace is often misunderstood as a condition that arrives when everything in life is settled, predictable, and comfortable. But real peace does not depend on external stability. It exists in a deeper place that is not easily shaken by circumstances. If peace only depended on the absence of problems, then it would be rare and temporary because life naturally contains challenges, delays, and unexpected changes. True peace, however, is internal. It is the presence of a steady trust that remains even when life feels unstable. Lou? It is the quiet assurance that what is beyond human control is still held by a higher wisdom. Faith that refuses to panic is not an emotional denial of reality, it is a disciplined response to reality. Panic is what happens when the mind believes it is alone in handling everything. It is the assumption that if immediate control is not established, everything will fall apart. Faith interrupts that assumption. It does not remove challenges, but it removes isolation. It reminds the heart that responsibility is shared with something greater than personal strength. When that awareness becomes active, the emotional weight of fear begins to decrease. The situation may still exist, but its power to overwhelm begins to weaken. There is a difference between feeling fear and being ruled by fear. Even the strongest individuals experience moments of uncertainty. Fear can appear in thoughts, emotions, and physical reactions. But panic is what happens when fear takes control of interpretation. It begins to shape decisions, reactions, and expectations. Faith does not eliminate the presence of fear, it changes its authority. Instead of allowing fear to dictate response, faith allows truth to guide it. The truth is that temporary conditions do not define permanent outcomes. The truth is that uncertainty is not the same as danger. The truth is that delay is not the same as denial. When these truths become internalized, panic loses its foundation. Peace grows in the space where trust is practiced repeatedly. Trust is not a single decision, it is a continuous choice made in moments of pressure. Every time a person chooses not to spiral into worst-case thinking, trust is strengthened. Every time they choose to pause instead of panic, trust is reinforced. This is why peace is not accidental, it is developed. It is built through small internal decisions that slowly rewire the way the mind responds to uncertainty. A faith-filled mind does not pretend that problems are not real. Instead, it refuses to elevate problems above possibility. It acknowledges difficulty but does not worship it. When problems become the center of attention, they grow in emotional size. But when trust becomes the center, problems are placed in proper perspective. They become situations to be navigated rather than forces that define identity or future. This shift is subtle but powerful. It allows a son to engage with life without being consumed by it. There is also a deep emotional freedom that comes when panic is replaced with trust. Panic creates urgency without direction. It pushes the mind into constant reaction mode where everything feels like an emergency. Trust, on the other hand, introduces stability into motion. It allows a person to act wisely instead of reacting impulsively. It slows down internal chaos and creates space for clarity. In that space, better decisions are made, healthier perspectives are formed, and emotional exhaustion begins to decrease. Faith that refuses to panic does not mean life becomes easy. It means life becomes bearable in ways it was not before. The same challenges that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable, not because their size has changed, but because internal strength has increased. That strength comes from repeated surrender, repeated trust, and repeated reminders that everything does not depend on human control alone. Over time, this kind of faith becomes a foundation. It shapes how a person responds to delays, disappointments, and uncertainty. Instead of immediate collapse into fear, there is a pause. Instead of emotio, now spiraling, there is reflection. Instead of panic, there is quiet confidence that even without full understanding, life is still moving in a meaningful direction. That is where peace begins to stabilize, not in perfect circumstances, but in a mind trained to trust beyond them. Not every thought that enters the mind deserves attention, and not every worry deserves permission to stay. One of the greatest sources of inner chaos is not the external world, but the internal habit of entertaining every mental suggestion as if it carries authority. Thoughts are constant, they arrive without invitation, they repeat without warning, and they often imitate truth even when they are rooted in fear. Spiritual and emotional maturity begins when a person learns that awareness does not require agreement. Just because a thought appears does not mean it must be accepted, analyzed, or emotionally processed. Many thoughts are temporary signals, not permanent truths, and the mind becomes peaceful when it learns this distinction. The human mind, when undisciplined, behaves like an open door in a storm. Everything enters fear, doubt, memory, imagination, prediction, and nothing is filtered. In that state, even harmless thoughts can grow into overwhelming anxiety. A single worry, if repeatedly entertained, can multiply into dozens of imagined scenarios. This is how the mind creates suffering beyond reality. What begins as a small uncertainty becomes a mental narrative that feels larger than life itself. The problem is not the thought itself, but the attention given to it. Attention is fuel. Whatever receives consistent attention begins to grow in emotional influence. Spiritual maturity introduces the discipline of selection. It teaches the mind to pause before engaging every internal voice. Not every suggestion is wisdom. Not every fear is insight. Not every possibility is prophecy. Some thoughts are simply echoes of past experiences, while others are projections of fears that may never materialize. Learning to identify this difference is essential for peace. Without this skill, a person becomes mentally reactive, constantly responding to internal noise as if it is external reality. There is a powerful transformation that happens when a person begins to practice mental surrender. Instead of arguing with every anxious thought, they learn to release it, instead of mentally rehearse. In worst-case scenarios, they learn to redirect attention. This is not suppression, it is discernment. Suppression tries to push thoughts away forcefully, often making them stronger. Discernment simply refuses to engage them. It acknowledges their presence but withdraws emotional energy from them. Over time, thoughts that are not fed begin to lose strength. Many worries survive only because they are repeatedly revisited. The mind has a habit of revisiting unresolved fears as if repetition will produce control. But repetition does not create control, it creates exhaustion. A worry rehearsed 100 times does not become more solvable, it becomes more emotionally draining. The discipline of releasing thoughts at their earliest stage prevents this cycle. It interrupts the pattern before it grows roots in the imagination. There is also a deeper truth about silence within the mind. A peaceful mind is not one that has no thoughts, it is one that is no longer controlled by them. Thoughts will still come, but their authority is weakened. They pass through like clouds instead of settling like storms. This shift happens when a person begins to treat thoughts as events rather than instructions. Cedions. An event can be observed without participation. An instruction demands action, but not every thought is an instruction. Many are simply noise. Learning this changes emotional life significantly. Anxiety decreases not because life becomes predictable, but because mental engagement becomes selective. Energy is no longer wasted on every imagined scenario. The mind begins to conserve strength for what is real, present, and actionable. This creates clarity, and clarity creates peace. Over time, the mind becomes trained in stillness. It no longer rushes to respond to every internal alarm. It begins to wait, observe, and discern. That pause between thought and response becomes the birthplace of wisdom. In that pause, fear loses automatic control, and peace gains space to emerge. The more this discipline is practiced, the more natural it becomes, until the mind no longer feels like a battlefield of thoughts, but a place of quiet awareness where truth is chosen over noise. True rest is not a condition that appears when life becomes easy. It is a transformation that develops when trust becomes deep and consistent. Many people search for rest in external changes, better circumstances, fewer problems, clearer answers, or more predictable outcomes. But life rarely offers permanent stability in those forms. Circumstances shift, seasons change, and uncertainty remains a constant part of human experience. If rest depended on external conditions, it would always be temporary. That is why real rest must be internal, rooted in something stronger than changing situations. It grows in the heart that has learned dependence, not independence, surrender, not control, trust, not anxiety. Dependence is often misunderstood in a world that celebrates self-reliance. People are taught to rely on their own strength, to secure their own future, and to manage every detail of life through effort alone. While responsibility is important, absolute self-reliance creates pressure that the human mind was never designed to carry. When a person believes everything depends solely on their ability, rest becomes impossible because the mind is always alert, always calculating, always preparing for possible failure. Dependence, in a deeper sense, does not remove responsibility, it reorders it. It acknowledges that effort is required, but outcomes are not fully controlled by effort alone. Recognition reduces internal pressure and opens the door for peace. Trust is the foundation upon which rest is built. But trust is not a passive feeling, it is an active practice developed over time. Every situation that challenges control becomes an opportunity to either tighten anxiety or strengthen trust. When a person chooses trust repeatedly, even in uncertainty, something begins to shift internally. The mind slowly learns that it does not need to predict every outcome to remain stable. It learns that uncertainty does not equal danger, and delay does not equal failure. This learning process is gradual, but it is powerful. It rewires emotional responses and creates stability in places where fear once dominated. Rest grows when obedience replaces anxiety-driven action. Anxiety pushes a person to act out of fear-rushing decisions, overanalyzing possibilities and forcing outcomes in an attempt to reduce uncertainty. But actions driven by anxiety rarely produce peace, even when they produce results. Obedience, in a deeper sense, means doing what is required in the present moment without trying to control every future outcome. It focuses on clarity rather than compulsion. It allows as a person to move forward without the emotional burden of needing to control everything at once. This kind of action brings relief because it separates effort from obsession. There is also a subtle but important shift that happens when trust becomes dominant over fear. The mind begins to slow down. Thoughts become less frantic. Internal dialogue becomes less chaotic. Instead of constant mental simulation of worst-case scenarios, there is a growing sense of stability. This does not mean problems disappear. It means problems no longer dominate inner space. The emotional weight attached to situations begins to decrease because the responsibility for outcomes is no longer carried alone. That shared sense of responsibility creates psychological relief, which is a core component of rest. Rest is also deeply connected to acceptance of process. Many people struggle because they want immediate resolution to long-standing issues. But life often unfolds in stages, not instant solutions. Trusting the process means allowing time to do what it naturally does: develop, reveal, and resolve. This requires patience, and patience is one of the most powerful forms of emotional strength. A patient mind. ND does not panic and delay. It observes, waits, and continues moving without internal collapse. That stability is a form of rest in motion. Over time, dependence and trust reshape identity. A person no longer defines themselves by how much they can control, but by how deeply they can trust. Effort remains, but pressure decreases. Responsibility remains, but anxiety weakens. Life continues with its challenges, but internal stability grows stronger. Rest becomes less about escaping difficulty and more about remaining grounded within it. In that state, the mind is no longer constantly fighting to hold everything together. Instead, it learns to move through life with quiet confidence, knowing that not everything depends on personal strength alone. Many people assume that spiritual growth is only about adding more discipline, more effort, and more mental control. But one of the deepest forms of growth actually comes through learning what to release. There are burdens people carry for years that were never meant to stay in their hands. These burdens are not always physical. Most of them are mental unresolved thoughts, repeated worries, imagined fears, and internal arguments that never run. Any conclusion. The human mind has a tendency to cling to what feels unresolved, as if constant thinking can somehow produce clarity. But in reality, excessive mental engagement often produces confusion rather than understanding. Growth begins when a person learns that release is sometimes more powerful than analysis. Letting go is not a sign of weakness, it is a form of wisdom. It takes strength to stop rehearsing the same fears, to stop revisiting the same emotional wounds, and to stop mentally trying to solve what is beyond immediate control. Many people remain stuck not because they lack ability, but because they keep carrying what they have already outgrown. Thoughts that were relevant in one season continue to echo in another, creating emotional weight that no longer matches present reality. Releasing those thoughts allows the mind to breathe again. It creates space for clarity, renewal, and emotional stability. One of the greatest obstacles to peace is the belief that every thought must be resolved before it can be released. But not every thought requires resolution. Some thoughts lose their power the moment they are no longer fed. The mind often creates loops repeating. NG scenarios, analyzing conversations, and imagining outcomes that may never occur. These loops feel productive, but they are actually draining. They create the illusion of progress while keeping the mind trapped in the same emotional place. Letting go breaks that loop. It interrupts the cycle of overthinking and restores mental balance. There is also a spiritual dimension to releasing thoughts. It is an act of trust, a quiet declaration that not everything must be controlled or fully understood in order to move forward. When a person releases mental burdens, they are essentially choosing to believe that life can continue without constant internal struggle. This does not mean ignoring reality, it means refusing to be emotionally dominated by it. It is the decision to stop carrying what continuously drains strength without producing clarity. Emotionally, letting go creates space for healing. The mind cannot fully heal while it is constantly revisiting what hurts it. Repeated mental engagement with pain keeps wounds active even when the original event has passed. But when a person stops revisiting those mental spaces, healing begins naturally. The mind, like the body, has the ability to recover when it is not constantly disturbed. Letting go is not forgetting, it is allowing the past to stop controlling the present. There is also freedom in accepting that some answers will come with time. not immediate effort. Human thinking often demands instant resolution, but life unfolds gradually. When answers are not available, the mind often fills the gap with worry. Letting go means refusing to let uncertainty become obsession. It is the ability to say, I do not need to solve this right now to continue living in peace. That mindset reduces emotional pressure and restores balance. Over time, the practice of letting go becomes a habit. The mind begins to recognize which thoughts are worth engaging and which are not. It becomes less reactive and more observant. Instead of holding on to every internal disturbance, it learns to release quickly. This creates a lighter emotional state, where thoughts no longer feel like burdens but passing experiences. The more this practice develops, the more space there is for calmness, clarity, and inner stability. Ultimately, growth is not only about what is added to life, but also about what is removed from it, and when unnecessary. Why mental weight is released? The mind becomes freer, stronger, and more capable of living in peace rather than constant internal struggle. Spiritual strength does not appear suddenly, and it is not built in moments of comfort. It develops slowly through repeated choices that reshape how a person responds to life. One of the most powerful transformations a person can experience is the shift from emotional reactivity to calm awareness. At the beginning of this journey, life may still look the same on the outside, problems still arise, delays still happen, and uncertainty still exists, but internally something begins to change. The mind starts learning how not to be ruled by immediate emotional reactions. Instead of collapsing into fear or rushing into panic, there is a growing ability to pause, observe, and respond with clarity. That pause becomes the foundation of emotional strength. At first, this pause is difficult. The natural tendency of the mind is to react quickly, especially when something feels threatening or uncertain. Reaction feels like control because it gives the illusion of doing something immediately. But most emotional reactions are driven by fear, not wisdom. They re-impulsive responses that often increase confusion rather than resolve it. As a person grows, they begin to notice the cost of constant reactivity. They realize that many of their past emotional decisions were made in haste, under pressure, or from anxiety rather than clarity. This awareness becomes the starting point of change. As the habit of pausing develops, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Emotional distance is created between the event and the response. This distance is not detachment from life, it is clarity within life. It allows a person to see situations more objectively instead of being fully absorbed by them. In that space, fear loses its immediate control. Instead of being overwhelmed by what is happening, the mind begins to evaluate what is actually true in the present moment. This shift reduces emotional exaggeration, which is often the root of unnecessary suffering. With continued practice, reflection begins to replace reaction. Reflection allows space for understanding. Instead of instantly labeling situations as disasters or failures, the mind begins to ask more grounded questions. What is actually happening right now? What is within my control? What is simply uncertainty that I cannot resolve at this moment? These questions bring structure to emotional chaos. They shift attention from fear-based assumptions to reality-based thinking. This is where emotional maturity begins to form. As reflection strengthens, stability starts to grow. Stability does not mean that emotions disappear, it means they no longer dominate decision-making. A stable mind can feel stress without becoming consumed by it. It can acknowledge uncertainty without falling into panic. It can experience disappointment without losing direction. This stability is not natural at first, it is trained through repetition. Each time a person chooses calm reflection over emotional reaction, they strengthen this inner foundation. Over time, this pattern becomes more automatic. The mind begins to default to stillness instead of chaos. Where there was once immediate fear, there is now a moment of pause. Where there was once confusion, there is now observation. This does not mean that challenges become smaller, but the internal response to them becomes wiser. Emotional energy is no longer wasted on extremes. Instead, it is directed toward understanding, patience, and deconstructive action. This transformation also changes how a person experiences life internally. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Not because they are easy, but because the internal response is no longer exaggerated. Emotional intensity decreases and clarity increases. The mind no longer jumps to worst-case scenarios as its first instinct. Instead, it begins to ground itself in what